An explosive diplomatic row between the US and Colombia over the deportation of unauthorized immigrants on military planes. It's been quickly diffused for now, but threats of further action are being made. What does this signal about the new Donald Trump presidency? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. A row that blew up almost as suddenly as it ended. Colombian President Gustavo Petro locking horns with his US counterpart Donald Trump before backing down. After US military planes carrying deported Colombians were barred from landing by Petro, Trump reacted swiftly with tariffs and sanctions. Retaliatory measures were announced by Colombia before an apparent climb down by President Petro. Deportation flights with military planes are to be allowed in, with Colombia promising dignified conditions for those on board. The speed of the escalation of hostilities between the two allies has surprised many. That's despite former leftist guerrilla Petro being at the other end of the political spectrum from Trump. So what's to be learned from this episode about the new Trump administration and how it plans to do business? And what might be the impact on undocumented immigrants in the US, as well as their countries of origin? We'll discuss all this with our panel of guests shortly, but first, this report from Sharif.
US President Donald Trump claims victory in a standoff with Colombia over tariffs and migration. The White House says the Colombian government has agreed to receive flights carrying migrants deported from the United States. It comes hours after Trump threatened to impose sweeping tariffs on all goods from the country.
Colombia's government has resolved its impasse with the government of the United States. We will continue to receive Colombians that return as deportees, ensuring dignified conditions for them as citizens with rights.
The standoff began after Colombian President Gustavo Petro refused to allow 2 U.S. military aircraft carrying deported migrants to land in Bogota. Trump retaliated by threatening to place sweeping tariffs on all goods from one of the U.S.'s closest allies in South America. He also threatened to impose restrictions on visas. Within hours, the two leaders engaged in tit-for-tat measures through social media. It left many people worried in a country that counts US as its biggest trade partner.
If they are deported, they must be received here because this is their country. If you come to your own country, how can you not be accepted? It's not logical.
Mr. Petro needs to think with a cool head, not ideologically, but regarding what's best for our country. I think he needs to think more.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The showdown came less than a week into Trump's second term. In his first day, he signed more than 200 executive orders, including declaring a national emergency on the southern border and ordering the military to help detain and transport migrants. His decision to action his election campaign promise to crack down on illegal immigration with mass deportations has led to buildings and homes being raided and migrants arrested in several American cities. That's raising tensions with Latin American countries, places of origin for up to 14 million undocumented migrants in the US. Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C. is Niall Stanage, a political analyst and White House columnist for The Hill newspaper. In Bogota, Colombia is Sergio Guzman, the director of Colombia Risk Analysis. That's a political consultancy. And in Alexandria, Virginia is Rachel Schmidtke, the senior advocate for Latin America at Refugees International. A very warm welcome to all of you. Sergio, I'll start with you in Bogota. Why the stunning turnaround from President Petro, who went from saying to Trump on Twitter, "Your blockade doesn't scare me," to, as the White House putting it, accepting deportees, even those arriving on US military aircraft, without limitation or delay?
Well, and first of all, thank you for having me. I think President Petro made a rash decision at 3 a.m. on Twitter to not receive a deportation flight, breaking with precedent that Colombia had received deportation flights, like the interview says. However, President Petro has decided, alongside other Latin American leaders, to try to be much more forceful about the dignity of people that are being deported and are being treated as they are by the United States Customs Enforcement Agency. I have to say, however, I think President Petro miscalculated hugely how Trump would react, because Trump and the White House issued very stern set of measures against Colombia that would be completely detrimental to our economy. So the miscalculation was a huge gamble, and it didn't pay off. And so Petro was brought to the table by the Trump administration to talk in a position of relative weakness. And now these are the consequences for Petro's brazen response to Trump's measure.
And it's a miscalculation because the US is Colombia's largest trading partner, of course. Sergio, just a quick question on what you're saying when you say that Colombia has accepted deportation flights before. Has it accepted deportation flights on military planes? Because that seemed to be the issue here for President Petro.
During the last 3 years, President Petro's administration, Colombia has accepted nearly 17,000 deportees. In the previous year, up to in January, almost 24 deportation flights have taken place, mostly on ice planes, granted. And so the use of military aircraft is a different issue, but it doesn't change the fact that these are Colombians, and by right, they should be welcomed in their own country.
Okay, Niall, the White House put out a statement saying today's events make clear to the world that America is respected again. Do you think that that's the message that the US was trying to send to the world? And what do you think the message the world is getting from what unfolded?
The Trump administration is certainly trying to send a message of strength and of a willingness to flex American muscle in respect of immigration and respect of everything else. And so this is a victory for President Trump. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The lessons that the rest of the world will take from it, I think, could be a little more mixed. Look, I think President Petro has done really significant damage to the general spectrum of nations who have issues or resistance or problems with President Trump's policies. Because Petro, by striking this very strong pose and then folding within about 6 hours, has just made it less credible when other nations seek to resist President Trump's urgings in these ways. So I think in that respect, it adds to Trump's momentum, but it also erodes the resistance to his wishes from other nations, because it looks so ridiculous on Petro's part.
Rachel, in one of his tweets before backing down, Petro spoke of the need to treat deportees with dignity, and he shared a video of Brazilian deportees being sent back to their country with their hands and their feet restrained and reportedly having been treated badly on the flight, not being allowed to use the toilet. I mean, does the Colombian president have a point? What is your assessment of how these deportees have been treated in the last week?
Yeah, I think the use of military planes takes a situation where deportees already have not been always treated the best. I've encountered deportees under the Biden and the Trump administration who've been, shackled at the hands and feet, who haven't been allowed to use the bathroom on the planes, et cetera. But putting them in cargo planes sort of accelerates this dehumanization of migrants, treating them as if they were violent criminals, which we don't have any proof that that's the case. I think it's sort of a posturing that that these people are dangerous in some way, and that America has this sort of right to exert its military might in other facets beyond the military, in places like migration, which I don't think is necessary. And it also, I think, demeans and reduces the humanity of people who maybe their only crime, quote unquote, was crossing a border.
And in fact, I want to ask you about the point that, Trump said that he wants Colombia to take back these criminals, and the White House actually said Trump expects all other nations to fully cooperate in accepting the deportation of their citizens illegally present in the US. Do we know about the makeup of the deportees on the flight since Trump took office? Do we know if they include people like asylum seekers, for example, who might have entered the US illegally, but have a right to seek asylum regardless of how they entered?
It's a great question. I think at this point we don't know the makeup, but it is very concerning and very true at this point that many people who entered legally under programs under the Biden administration, for example, are now subject to deportation, even though they followed the correct procedures. I've interviewed Colombians who passed through the Darien Gap all the way through Central America to get to Mexico. They used the CBP-1 application as they were told. They entered through a CHNB parole program that was legally a pathway that was available to them at the time. And now they're scared they're about to be deported. And I think that is a true fearful tactic for people who quote unquote did it the right way. I think that that's the point I want to emphasize, is that there's not only a threat to illegal or unauthorized immigration, but there's also now a threat to people who entered in a manner that was legal. And so that is very concerning.
And Niall, that is absolutely something we've seen, isn't it, in the first week of the executive actions taken on immigration. It's not just a crackdown on illegal immigration, it's a crackdown on pathways to enter the US legally, including ending things like the refugee resettlement program. How would you describe those actions, and what is the Trump administration trying to do?
Restrictionist actions from an administration that believes in a restrictionist policy. Now, I think we do have to say, in fairness, that immigration was perhaps the single strongest issue for President Trump in November's election. It was a real vulnerability for Democrats that they were perceived as less restrictionist. And certainly at the southern border of the United States, unauthorized crossings reached their highest point in decades, if not ever, about a year ago. They have fallen since then. But look, I think that the issue that you mentioned about ending the refugee resettlement program does point to the issue that Rachel raised about the generalized reluctance or resistance to permit migrants just generally. Now, of course, President Trump appears to have a somewhat different view of the classic style of migration that is fully legal under employment visas, for example. But when it comes to refugees, asylum seekers, and of course people who are just flat out unauthorized migrants, he has a very, very different view.
And Rachel, coming back to you, because we are talking about the refugee resettlement program that has been suspended indefinitely, and so many refugees who have been, who have gone through the very long vetting process and have been waiting sometimes for years, including those in Afghanistan who assisted the US military, have had their travel plans suspended or even cancelled. Isn't the US a signatory to the Refugee Convention, and does it have obligations?
Yes. The short answer is yes. The U.S. is party to the 1951 Convention, and so it does have international obligations, as well as the right to seek asylum is enshrined in our domestic laws as well. And so, and I think from a moral perspective, we are a very wealthy, prosperous nation that was founded on immigrants, and I think that people who have fled violence, as stipulated in the convention, should have a right to seek protection elsewhere. And the United States has absolutely the resources, and I think the responsibility to do that, especially when we look at other countries in the region, like Colombia, that have over 2 million Venezuelans that they've received. That's much larger, and Colombia has much less resources, not much less, but less resources than the United States to do so, and they're doing it. And so I think that the United States, we could learn a lot from our Latin American neighbors in terms of what it means to actually welcome people.
Yeah, and Colombian undocumented migrants from Colombia actually make up a small number of the undocumented migrants from Latin America in the US.
Yes.
Sergio, does Trump's move, do you think, to impose sanctions when Colombia refused the military flights, does it show just how he sees tariffs as an economic weapon, to use against governments that aren't going to play a part in his geopolitical goals?
Well, I think the Trump administration's tactics have always been to impose maximum pressure on adversaries regardless of them being friends or foes, to try to extract a concession. And in this regard, Petro's acknowledgement of the terms that the U.S. laid out is basically giving him opportunities to do so in the future. So I think Petro's lack of tact and lack of strategic vision, he could have, he's meeting CELAC, the Latin American group of countries, on Thursday, and they're coming up with a joint policy to address this. So I think this dispute is far from over. I think Trump has won the first round clearly, but I also anticipate there to be a lot of friction between Latin American countries and the United States over the years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. That is something that we're going to be watching very closely. Niall, if future sanctions lead to, say, higher prices for US consumers, then will the American public object, do you think? Will they be willing to tolerate some financial pain to advance Trump's immigration policies?
I think there are two separate issues to keep disentangled there. One is Trump's purported love for tariffs, which almost all economists consider potentially inflationary. And whoever he imposes those tariffs on, there is the chance that those will lead to rising prices. And voters, I think, would react very negatively to that. But that, Elizabeth, is a separate issue from his argument and his allies' argument that he sometimes threatens tariffs as a negotiating tactic. It appears to have worked very effectively in this case, whether one likes it or not. And so the idea of using the threat of tariffs as a weapon to force other governments to change their policy, I think that is something that a significant number of Americans would back, actually. And I'm also just wary of us getting into a situation where we underestimate the degree to which the American population has shifted somewhat to the right on immigration, even within my 20 years or so in this country, to favour the more restrictionist policies that Mr. Trump wants.
And Rachel, why is that? Because as Niall said himself earlier, despite the number of crossings having peaked during the Trump administration, they did come down after the Biden administration, imposed restrictions on asylum. In the last month that Biden was president, in December 2024, there were 47,300 migrant encounters. In the last month of Trump's first term, illegal crossings hovered around 71,000. So why is it that that's not something that affects the public sentiment?
I think that Niall is right in that there has been a shift on our thoughts on immigration. And I think there's also somewhat of a disconnect between what we see of people arriving to the southern border and immigrants that we may see in our communities who are business owners and contributing in many different ways, not only through their labor, but through their heritage and culture and personal connections. The people that are arriving at the southern border to seek asylum will eventually become the people that we consider our neighbors. But I think that the American people have been sold a sort of villainous idea of immigration through much of Trump's rhetoric and scapegoating them as the problem for some of our economic woes. And I think that that's misguided, but is a very pervasive and powerful idea. And I think that those of us like myself at Refugees International are going to have to work very hard to show that immigrants are extremely a huge benefit to our communities, again, not only through their labor, as I said, but through their ability to contribute to our communities in so many different ways. And losing that is not only a material loss for our country, an economic loss for our country, but also a cultural and moral loss for our country as well.
And Sergio, when Latin American countries meet to figure out how to deal with this Trump administration going forward, especially on immigration, do you think that the administration is interested in working with its neighbours on this issue beyond cracking down on immigrants at the border and carrying out deportations?
Well, I think, unfortunately, they're very short-sighted about how to achieve success in terms of immigration. And I think the Biden administration took a much more long-term view of immigration, saying, if there's development in countries in Latin America, there will not be as much immigration to the United States. Whereas Trump says we need to crack down on the border, we need to close the border, and we need to threaten with, economic tariffs or huge impositions that will in turn exacerbate the economic woes of each of those countries and produce more migrants going to the United States. And so I think in a way, they're not, neither Petro nor Trump are thinking about this strategically, much to the detriment of a bilateral relation that's taken decades to strengthen, decades to harden, and right now is at risk.
And Niall, is there anyone in the Trump administration, do you think, is looking at this issue strategically? His pick for Deputy Secretary of State, for example, Christopher Landau, he's long argued that working with other countries to stop what he calls such migratory flows, that there must be a global imperative for US foreign policy. But do such spats, do they make working together more difficult?
I think that there are people who, in the Trump administration, look at this issue strategically. They just have a different strategy from the one that you just outlined. I mean, there are people like Stephen Miller, for example, a very senior, very close aide to Donald Trump, who has an extremely hawkish position on immigration and has done for years and years and years. And the strategy, so far as he is concerned, is to essentially come as close to you can as closing the border, or with the exception of legal immigration that helps the United States economy directly. So there is a separate argument to be made, of course, about the broader strategy regarding causes of immigration, what are the root drivers of immigration, especially from Mexico and Latin America. Of course, those arguments can be made, but the idea that those arguments get a significant hearing in the Trump administration or carry any real weight in the Trump administration, I think is a fallacy. I don't think they do at all. I think it's a much more MAGA, America first, build the wall mentality that animates the Trump administration on this topic.
And Sergio, Niall mentioned Mexico. It's been reported that Mexico refused a request last week to let a US military aircraft land with migrants. Trade between Colombia and the US is a tiny fraction of the trade between the US and Mexico. Could we see, Trump has long threatened to impose tariffs, even of 25% on Mexico. He even mentioned February 1st as a possible date. I think that's this weekend. Do you think that we could see Trump go ahead with such tariffs on Mexico if it doesn't support his policies at the border?
Well, I think Trump is not oblivious to the fact that Mexico and Canada both play a huge role in the U.S. economy as price setters, right? And that will have, as Niall said before, a huge inflationary effect on the American consumer. And so I think Trump wants to curtail that specifically. But at the same time, Colombia was such a soft target, one that was very exemplary, one that was very easy to use without affecting the American consumer as much. And Trump used that leverage. He took advantage of that opportunity, much to the detriment of the bilateral relationship. Let's hope that doesn't happen with Canada and Mexico as well.
And Rachel, again, with so many undocumented migrants, up to 14 million in the United States from Latin America, what does this incident tell us about how Latin American countries, about what they're expecting from this administration, and in fact, what the people from those countries are expecting?
I think many are bracing for the possibility of increased deportation. Mexico's strategy has been to start preparing for Mexicans to return, with a new program called Mexico Te Abraza, Mexico Hugs You, Mexico Embraces You. And so I think many countries are bracing for that likely inevitability. But I also think that there is going to be a negative impact on many communities that have sent migrants to the United States because they rely very directly on remittances. And in many cases, those remittances allow people to, go to school, pay for healthcare, homes. And so those remittances actually keep people, in many cases, from migrating. And so I think local communities may also feel the effect and may be worried about what the loss of that huge economic boon might be for their welfare and well-being in their home countries as well.
And Sergio, this spat, as we've been reporting, is over for now, but Petro is known to be hot-headed, as we've mentioned, the other end of the political spectrum to Donald Trump. Can this long-standing relationship between the US and Colombia, what are you expecting from the next 4 years?
Well, I think, for one, Petro is going to begin looking at diversifying Colombia's set of alliances. We've talked about Petro's strategic ambiguity with other countries, but now we saw, for instance, yesterday, the Chinese ambassador to Colombia and the Russian ambassador to Colombia both touting the benefits of joining the BRICS as an alliance. And Colombia is on the brink of doing that. And this might just push us over the edge, unfortunately so.
Niall, does Trump believe in allies? Does it worry him that this relationship with Colombia might be strained, or that Colombia might seek closer ties with Russia or China as a result of this? If any allies seek closer ties with the US's traditional foes?
I don't think he is concerned about allyships in the normal fashion that we have expected of American presidents from both parties. The whole idea of America first and a more go-it-alone attitude speaks to that. Now, he does get irritated, I would say, by the expanding sphere of influence of China in particular. Some of his arguments, for example, the idea of buying back or trying to force the buyback of the Panama Canal, that's about trying to curb Chinese influence. So I think to that extent he cares. I just want to briefly return, very briefly, to what I think is the really important point here, which is that President Petro here has done an enormous disservice to what we might call the international resistance against President Trump and his measures by trying to play tough, by, as we say here, bringing a knife to a gunfight, throwing these shapes and then backing down within hours. That has put enormous wind in Trump's sails and has really hampered those who would seek to make a more modulated version of the same argument.
All right, we will have to end the discussion on that very important point. Thank you to all of our guests, Niall Stanage in Washington, D.C., Sergio Guzman in Bogota, and Rachel Schmidtke in Alexandria, Virginia. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the whole team here, bye for now.